Welcome, friends. You're listening to Breakfast in the Ruins, a Michael Moorcock flavoured podcast. Michael Moorcock had a massive influence on the pop culture zeitgeist of the 60s and 70s, and his influence is shot right through fantasy fiction to this day. But, as any Moorcock aficionado will likely tell you, he's also been a defining presence in music too, for many people and bands. Since getting his first drum kit and then guitar in his early teens, Mike was deeply immersed in the music world, playing in multiple skiffle groups in the 50s, before settling on his chief passion and pursuit, writing the stories we love to this day, and supporting and promoting other talents through his editorial work. But music was never too far away, and he remained creatively involved with a number of high-profile rock bands, such as Hawkwind and Blue Oyster Cult, and influenced countless others over the years, including those emerging through the new wave of British heavy metal in the early 80s like the Tigers of Pantang and Diamond Head. That influence continues to manifest today, as evidenced by a number of projects available on creative spaces like Bandcamp, and we'll look at some of those in the future, including one by our very own patron Dave. More on that next show. For now though, we're taking a look at the most obvious collaboration that Mike made in the 70s, with the busy and extremely varied output of the British band Hawkwind, and we'll be doing that with writer Ian Abrahams. And later, Loz will pop in to talk about his contribution to the Murcock music crossover. So, sit back, crank up the space rock, and join us in Derry Toms. And we're back in Derry Toms, virtual Derry Toms, of course. And today my guest is Ian Abrahams, writer, biographer, lover of space rock, counterculture, runs the No Star Unturned blog, and is a Hawkwind biographer who wrote a book called Sonic Assassins. Ian, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Yeah, really nice to be on and have a chat.
Yeah, I've been wanting to touch on Murcock and music ever since we started this, and I think we've occasionally mentioned it, and Keck W and I discussed it very, very briefly on the last show, but it's really fantastic to get someone on the show who has that investment in, of course, when we talk about Murcock and music, the first thing that comes to people's minds generally is Hawkwind, even though, of course, he's interacted with other bands as well and written with Blue Oyster Cult and various other bits and things, but the biggie for most people is Hawkwind. So what I generally ask all of our new guests is, how did you come across Murcock in the first place? Was it through Hawkwind or other means?
I think it's really interesting, actually. I was thinking about this over the last few days, and although I've not read extensively of Mike Moorcock's work, I've read quite a bit, but I sort of edged up to Moorcock in the same way as I edged up to Hawkwind in a way, and they sort of crossed over in a sense, because I came to the work of Mike Moorcock not through any of his stories or through any of his novels or through his work with Hawkwind, but I can remember very vividly being 13 or 14 and a Sunday afternoon trip to my local beach, which would be Perranporth in Cornwall, where there was a secondhand bookstore sitting on the car park. And I picked up a couple of issues, and I probably paid about 10p each for them, but a couple of issues of New Worlds magazine. And I remember them very vividly. One was issue 158, which is the one with the Roger Zelazny Love is an Imaginary Number, I think it's called, story, is the cover one.
Yeah.
And it has Charles Platt's dystopian rock and roll sci-fi environmental crossover story, The Failures, in it, which felt really edgy and exciting when you were 13 or 14.
Yeah.
And from there, I sort of span off into reading Sir Michael Moorcock. So I'd read a little bit of Jerry Cornelius when I was a teenager, and I read Behold the Man, which again, like Charles Platt in that Moorcock edited magazine, just felt edgy. And I haven't read it for years, and I was looking at it the other day and thinking, I must get this from my Kindle and have a read of it again. Because I had one of the British paperback editions, Panther editions, I guess. and for years afterwards was looking for a copy of Breakfast in the Ruins, which I finally found, an American paperback in the much missed Forever People shop in Bristol, in Park Street in Bristol, which to go up in the 80s for Hawkwind gigs. So I sort of got to understand Mike Moorcock and what he was all about. And at the same time, I was gradually edging into Hawkwind because I used to go to, and I guess this would be, I was 16, 17, 18. I used to go to gigs at the St Austell Cornwall Coliseum, and which was a huge venue on the beach in St Austell. No, long gone now. But my cousin used to drive. This is the days, of course, I was too young to drive or just learning to drive. And he had a copy of the Hawkwind album, Live 79, as his cassette. It was his cassette of choice for going to gigs. And I'd heard of Hawkwind and I sort of knew about Silver Machine, but I wasn't, I didn't have any records and they'd sort of passed me by a bit. But he was playing Live 79 and I got really excited about it. And that sort of grungy punk crossover that wasn't quite what I thought Hawkwind were all about, but it was shot down in the night and it was Spirit of the Age and it was Motorway City. So I was getting really excited about that. And at the same time, the BBC had their little documentary series about science fiction writers that I think came out about 1980, Time Out of Mind. And the first one was the Michael Moorcock edition of that, which had a little bit of mention of Hawkwind. And as I recall, a clip of the promo film for Silver Machine that's known as the Top of the Pops clip, but is actually not a BBC film, it's a brought-in clip. And this all joined up. So I was sort of understanding Mike Moorcock and reading about New Worlds, finding copies in secondhand shops and understanding that whole thing with, its relevance in the counterculture in the 1960s.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I was discovering Hawkwind and I was buying records like Sonic Attack had just come out, which of course Mike contributes lyrics to and does the vocals on Coded Languages. So there was a sort of moment there where I was, just after school age, I was 17, 18, 19, and I was discovering Mike Moorcock's work and I was discovering Hawkwind almost on parallel lines in a way of finding that they were both, even though Mike is, really known for the Elric stuff and the, Dances on the Edge of Time and, as a fantasy writer as well as a science fiction writer. But, Mike always says that Hawkwind's best stuff is urban. It's about the city. And some of the stuff that I liked about New Worlds was that way as well. So I was sort of joining up their relevance to the underground and the counterculture and getting excited and reading about it, So I was, following the history of Hawkwind and also understanding the history of New Worlds and its publication of Bugjack Baron, its banning by W.H. Smith, its rescue by the Arts Council, all that stuff when you were 18 and 19, and reading about the history of this felt really, really provocative and appealing. So, so my interest in both had that parallel thing of discovering that, the interconnectedness between the two.
That must be, it's really exciting for a teenager, isn't it? Because that making those discoveries and those connections and having those little epiphanies is one of the fun things about reading Murcock, because I think most people I talk to read them all completely out of order.
Yeah.
If you're trying to apply any kind of order, for example, to the Elric sequence, it's pretty difficult, and no matter how you do it and no matter how you carve it, it can be jarring.
Well, I think people like that, though, don't they? Because you get the same thing with the Sherlock Holmes fans, where they try and piece together and end up saying that some of the stories can't be part of the canon because they won't fit in any timeline and stuff.
Yeah.
And I would imagine people do the same thing on some of Mike's work that has that interconnected web of relationships to each other. And I'm not really well read on Mike's stuff, but I've read Elric, I've read Jerry Cornelius. Most recent thing I read of his was The Whispering Swarm.
Yeah.
And so he's always been there in the background, and I've always liked his work.
Yeah.
And so when I interviewed him for my book, that was a real thrill. And it was an email interview. I've never spoken to him in person, but to actually be corresponding by email for the book, and then for a few little things I wrote afterwards for Record Collector, it's just such a thrill that this was the guy who was editing New Worlds. This is
Mm,
the guy who wrote Behold the Man, and he's taken an interest. And when my Hawkwind book came out, he name checked it in a review of the year he did for a website. And
fabulous.
for me in small town Cornwall, and a nobody, to be recognised by Michael Moorcock,
Yeah,
it's fantastic.
yeah. It's started to kind of fall into place a little bit as to how you came across the podcast, because I think you said when we first communicated that somebody had given you our business card.
I was on a radio interview in a community radio thing in Falmouth,
Yeah,
and basically talking about Hawkwind, and also a book I wrote on the free festivals culture called
yeah.
Festivalized. We did a little an hour of chatting about Hawkwind and playing some Hawkwind and some Here and Now, and some Hall and Oates as my guilty pleasure. But and at the end, Lou, the presenter, gave me a business card and said, "Oh, you ought to find out about this."
Well,
So
the curious thing about that is we went to Penzance on holiday in March because Phil's brother is down there and his family. So we went down to Penzance for a week and spent some time with them as well. I think they're somewhere around Helston. I can't remember the exact name of the village. But we went to a launderette to dry some clothes because we were there in March. The weather wasn't great, so we did some washing. This is terribly exciting podcast information, but it's essential information. And we went to a launderette to dry some clothes, and there was a cork board on the wall, and I had one card in my wallet, and I stuck it on the cork board, and somehow that made its way.
Somehow that card got to me.
Somehow that card got to you.
Well,
One
there you
card
are. I mean,
in Cornwall
we
on
talked about.
a launderette wall in Penzance.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah,
Isn't that amazing?
yeah. That's quite crazy. But
Well, you wouldn't believe it. You wouldn't believe it.
The moonbeam roads work in very, very strange ways. So thanks to that DJ friend of yours, it's worked out quite nicely.
Yeah, exactly.
So how do you go from being a Hawkwind fan as a teenager to writing about Hawkwind, writing a biography?
I think because when I was younger, I wanted to be a journalist, and that was never a. I think I didn't apply myself very hard at school, and therefore it wasn't. It ended up for different reasons not being a path I took. But I always had that thing, I used to do comics fanzines in the 1970s. I'd my dad, where my dad worked, they had one of those stencil printer machines, Gestetner or whatever they were called.
Yeah.
And I used to produce a little comics fanzine that I'd run off 50 copies of and send out to people. And I was, so I was always receiving comics fanzines and science fiction fanzines. So I was, really keen on that, and was contributing to a lot of the comics fanzines that were around in the mid to late 70s. So there was a burning desire of a sort to do some writing. And in the 80s, I had this idea I'd like to review music and stuff. And I wrote a review of, I think it was one of the live Hawkwind albums that had come out, and sent it to Sounds newspaper, who replied and said, oh yeah, not what we're looking for, but keep in touch about music in your area. And I, for whatever reason, took it as a resounding no, and didn't try again for decades to write anything. And then, bizarrely, because it's not very rock and roll, I wrote a couple of 3 advice pieces for various accountancy magazines. I told you it wasn't very rock and roll.
It's about as rock and roll as a laundrette.
Yeah, about as rock and roll as a laundrette, exactly. Yeah. And I just, the idea of wanting to be a writer never went away. So I ended up, working in accountancy, and, just always harboring this, wouldn't it be great if I wrote something? So I had this quite wacky idea in hindsight, although things have changed and print on demand would have made it not such a wacky idea these days. But in the early 2000s, it was more wacky an idea that I could write a book on Hawkwind and I could publish it myself and sell it at gigs. Wouldn't that be a really good thing to do? Because nobody had written a book on Hawkwind.
Yeah.
So I wrote a couple of sample chapters from things I researched and sent it to Chris Tate, who was Hawkwind's manager and is now Dave Brock's wife, and said, "Oh, I really want to write this book on Hawkwind. Here's a couple of sample chapters. Can I get an interview?" sort of thing. And was very surprised to receive a reply saying, Dave thought it was all right, but he remembers it differently in some places. Why don't you come and have lunch with us and have a chat? So I drove up from Cornwall to Devon, had lunch with them, did a bit of an interview with no experience of interviewing anybody whatsoever, but did this interview. And Dave said, "Oh, that's very good. Well, the rest of the band are rehearsing at my place, so why don't you come and say hello to Alan and Richard, as it was then?"
Yeah.
So we drove up into the hills around where Dave lives, and went to his place and sat in his milking shed studio and met Alan Davey and Richard Chadwick and did some interviews. And it sort of took on a bit of life of its own, because Dave had scrapbooks of photos and stuff and said, "Well, I can give you access to this." And then I got interviews with people like Nick Turner, and I made contact with various ex-band members, and Mike Moorcock, for example, Phil Franks, who'd taken lots of photography of the band in the early days and worked with Barney Bubbles on some of the concepts for the Hawkwind log in Search of Space. And it sort of grew and grew in that respect. So suddenly the wacky idea of writing a book and publishing it myself seemed not quite fit for purpose. And so I took myself off to the local Waterstones and had a look through at the music section as to who was publishing what. Found a book on craft work that was published by a company called SAF and sent them the manuscript as my first attempt to pitch a book to a publisher. I got a phone call a couple of weeks later saying, "Yeah, let's agree in advance, we'll do it."
Wonderful.
Which was quite startling in its own way. And so there I was with a book contract, having never written anything longer than 1,000 words for an accountancy magazine or stuff for fanzines many years previously. And unfortunately, I had a really good mate of mine who was both a fiction writer and a non-fiction writer, and wrote TV tie-ins, Doctor Who novels, and program guides and that sort of thing. So he sort of read each chapter as I went along, and there was a great one where I'd written at length about New Worlds, W.H. Smith, Arts Council, Bug Jack Barron, all that stuff, to get a phone call from him saying, "Ian, I can tell you know lots and lots and lots about New Worlds, but this is a book about Hawkwind."
Yeah.
And so it all got cut in the end. And he lived and still does live in Newcastle. And when the book was finished, the sort of fortnight before it was due to the publishers, I went up and I think at the time the publishers had contracted like 120,000 words, and I had about 160,000. And we sat in his flat in Newcastle with a bottle of Stilishnia, with the snow coming down outside in the middle of winter, and just read it out loud and cut 40,000 words, And the fact that I managed to produce a book that needed minimum editing from the publishers was all down to my friend Keith Topping, who did the sterling work of being a published writer and knowing what bear traps I was falling into.
Yeah.
And made it okay, So that was how I got into writing about Hawkwind. A wacky idea of publishing it myself. Now, of course, it came full circle because SAF Publishing, who published a really great catalogue of books on music, seemed to be no longer publishing anymore. So the rights effectively had come back to me a few years ago, and this time around, rather than looking for another publisher, I took the advantage of Amazon Create Space and did my own print-on-demand version, and learned how to create a printable file and how to lay it out, and rewrote it top to bottom, because I was then a 15 years better writer, and came up with a second edition that I was much happier with, in terms of being able to correct things, smooth out some errors, smooth out the writing a little bit, add to it with lots of great stuff I'd had over the years since, when I've been writing about Hawkwind for Record Collector and Vive Le Rock and Shindig and places like that, and beef it up into the new edition. So what started out, as I say, as a wacky idea of self-publishing, via SAF, who took a chance on me, came full circle a couple of years ago to self-publishing the second edition.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's an amazing kind of first step into the world of kind of biographying. That's a terrible adjective, but writing a biography for a band. What was it? Why Hawkwind? Sorry, why Hawkwind?
Why Hawkwind? Because they'd always been my favourite band since I heard Live 79 on the road to the Sonostal Coliseum. And I'd seen them a lot over the years then. So, I'd seen them at Sonostal, and then in the 80s, my friend and I used to regularly go to Colston Hall, or the Hippodrome occasionally, Hippodrome for the Black Sword tour, bringing it back to Mike Moorcock stuff. But generally Colston Hall, we become travelling Hawkwind fans, because that's the thing about Hawkwind gigs is they're well attended, but they're well attended by the same people. Wherever you go, there's a big travelling fan contingent. But we used to go to Bristol, occasionally we go to London and stuff to see them, and so they were very much my favorite band beyond all others. And so had a burning desire to write, and it was an itch that I had to scratch. And if I was going to do a book on a band, who was it going to be? Well, it was going to be Hawkwind, because nobody else had done it. I mean, there were a couple of things published, but they were without being disparaging, they were beefed up fanzines in a way, and nobody had commercially published a biography of Hawkwind. So, and then it was just the treat of actually meeting all these wonderful characters. And of course, the thing about Hawkwind is that, there's been a lot of toing and froing within the membership over the years. So everybody wants to give their point of view. So it was very easy to get interviews. And you had to moderate that a little bit, because I wasn't writing a News of the World style book. I was writing a book that was really trying to say, look how much I love this band, So there was lots of stuff that I heard and I just left on the cutting room floor, as it were, metaphorically, because it just wasn't the sort of thing I was interested in writing about. At the same time, the much missed Carol Clark was writing the saga of Hawkwind. So we sort of hit on the same thing concurrently, as it were. And we did talk a bit during the time that I was writing Sonic Assassins, and she was writing Saga. And this is how amateurish I was to start out with, because I'd given Carol a couple of contacts to progress her book, and she gave me Lemmy's phone number in Los Angeles. And I'm sitting at work with this piece of paper with Lemmy's phone number on it, thinking, you don't just ring up Lemmy. You don't just ring up Lemmy. And I never did.
That's
and
quite an
impressive
quid pro quo, though, isn't
it? It was a very generous, and Carol, who'd written for Melody Maker and had written masses of biographies of music, and East End Gangsters was her other big thing that she used to write a lot of ghost-written autobiographies of gangsters and stuff. But for her to take me seriously and pass me on contact, and she was really good to me. When the books came out, we discussed with each other the reactions we've got on them, and I was then breaking into writing for Record Collector, and I was tipped off. I'd done a little interview with Captain Sensible at a gig in Falmouth for a reissue that come out, and I was tipped off by their reviews editor Jake at the time, who said, I think the editor's looking for a 15th anniversary or whatever it was, Damned feature. Why don't you pitch it? So I did, and Carol very kindly then set me up with Brian James and with Rat Scabies to get interviews with them for the feature I was writing. So she was very, very kind to me, and took me seriously where I was an amateur in a world that she was a very hard-bitten professional, So that was really great.
That's kind of a great level of generosity, isn't it?
I think so. I think she was, my claim to fame, I always say my journalistic claim to fame was I had a boozy Soho lunch with Carol Clark once.
Yeah.
But I couldn't keep up with her. But she's gone now, and music writing's poorer for that, because she was a great lady and very, very generous to somebody she could have looked on as as an amateur and not bothered with. So that was, and so ironically, having picked on Hawkwind because nobody had done a book on Hawkwind, 2 came out within 6 months, and I was first and she was second. But they sort of fed off each other, and I'd said to the publisher in my naivety, "Won't that? Do you still want to do it now? This other one's coming out." And he said, "That's good news, because the sales reps at the distributors will sit up and take notice and think something's going on here, and they'll get behind both." And I think that's what actually happened.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it must have been great for the band if nobody had told their story before, and then all of a sudden there are 2 people out there producing, biographical information about them. It must have been fantastic for them, and there's no wonder they were so communicative and generous with you in terms of time.
I think so. I think it's tricky when you're a band at that level, maybe, because they. I've talked to Dave Past in the past about things he didn't agree with in the first edition, and I listened to some of that, and in the second edition I rephrased some stuff and changed some stuff and kept some stuff where I didn't agree with. But Astounding Sounds Amazing Music is an album that he famously hates and I absolutely love, and I wasn't going to change my view for it, But I think, if you're Bruce Springsteen and somebody's publishing a book on you every month, that's one thing. If you're Hawkwind and nobody's published a book on you and 2 come out, then there's 2 things about it. One is, isn't this great? It validates us, and another is, well, I don't agree with this and I don't agree with that, and it becomes difficult, But I've always got on with them, and that's how I see that. But I think the interesting thing is, and it's more to do with Carol really, because Carol was writing for classic rock and places like that who were running excerpts from her book, and because her book was an omnibus publication, it had more visibility. But I think that when I roll back before those books came out, music press did not take Hawkwind seriously, and so even new studio albums might get a couple of lines somewhere, and suddenly Carol and I were rocking up at music magazines and wanted to write about Hawkwind, and the books were out, and suddenly there seemed to be a sea change over the years as to how Hawkwind's been perceived in the music press.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that's all down to me and Carol, but I think we struck a tone of saying, actually, you can take this band seriously, and they do mean something, and they do have a legacy, and they have influenced punk, and they have influenced rave, and they have influenced the festival scene. And so don't laugh at them as being some sort of hippie dinosaur band, because they've always had a relevance. When I interviewed people like Jello Biafra from the Dead Kennedys, and various people who are involved in the rave scene and stuff, and they all came along and validated what the band was about. And so I think that it was the start of the music press starting to take Hawkwind a little bit more seriously, which is what they should be doing.
Yeah, I think rightly now that their first half dozen albums are kind of commonly considered classics, aren't they? But back in the early 80s or in the mid 80s, I think in my social circles, unless you were a Murcock fan, Hawkwind were the people who did Silver Machine and had the naked girl on stage.
Yeah, and they're always going to live with that that tag, aren't they? And which is fine. I imagine Silver Machine's looked after Dave Brock very well over the years, quite rightly so. If you've got a publishing credit on something like that, it's always going to come and help you out in your old age, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's that's great. And actually, I mean, I saw it the other day. I was watching one of the Now TV channels on Sky, and it came out. They were doing 1972, and I thought, well, I bet Silver Machine pops up in a minute, and up pops the Silver Machine clip that ran on Top of the Pops in 1972.
Yeah,
and you can see, and I've often said it, but you can see when you watch that, bit like Bowie doing Starman on Top of the Pops, or in the next decade Morrissey turning up with the gladioli hanging out of his back pocket. If you were wired up, if you were 13 or 14 in 1972 and wired up a certain way, and you saw that promo film, that's going to change your life,
Yeah.
And it just, it's still fantastic to this day. So even though I would say half of the gigs I've been to of Hawkwind, they haven't played Silver Machine. And even though I sort of agree with Frenchie from Flickknife, who says, the only Hawkwind song like Silver Machine is Silver Machine, and it's not typical.
Yeah.
It's still not a bad albatross to have around your neck, is it?
No, certainly not. I think.
But you're right. I mean, in music terms, they did it, particularly in the '80s. They dropped out of the mind's eye, didn't they? They became that band. It was, it was Tastier, it was Lemmy, it was Silver Machine, it was the first half a dozen albums, and so I just think that people wanting to write about them in this century has just added a little bit of respectability to it again, and I think that's well deserved. But I think that's, as I say, I think hopefully I've contributed a little bit to that. But certainly Carol with the Saga of Hawkwind was a big driver on that, I think.
Yeah. So reading Sonic Assassins, I always love the origins of these things, and I always particularly love reading about Eel Pie Island.
Oh yes, yeah.
Because it's just, if there's ever anything that makes you feel like you were born in the wrong decade, it's reading about Eel Pie Island and what an experience that must have been. And of course, in the early fledgling days of Hawkwind, they were involved in all of that counterculture scene.
Yeah.
And I think one of the fascinating things about Hawkwind, if you look at them today, they're like the prog rock version or the psychedelic rock version of The Fall, except, rather than that one core figure, they've got a couple who alternately do and don't get on.
Yes.
over the years.
Yes.
And that kind of causes the complications.
Well, I think, it is a good analogy, though, because Dave really is the core figure. And I get what you're saying. But I think I talked about this the other day in a different context, because the next thing I wrote after Sonic Assassins was a book on the Waterboys called Strange Boat, Mike Scott and the Waterboys. And the Waterboys is very, very analogous to Hawkwind in the way that this revolving cast of characters are all on the outskirts of this one guy's vision.
Yeah.
So Mike Scott and the Waterboys, Dave Brock and Hawkwind, who brings people in and then they go and maybe they come back. And the Waterboys have something like 80 or 90 current and past members, and Hawkwind's a little bit like that. One person. And the interesting thing is that every Waterboys album is different from the previous and different from the next, and Hawkwind are like that as well.
Yeah.
So it's about that really clever thing that Dave Brock and Mike Scott are able to do. Maybe Marky Smith as well, but I'm not really familiar enough with the Fool's work to know that. But being able to hear the sound of the moment and bring together the right people to create that sound. Of course, that always leads to disappointment when you don't want them for the next thing.
Yeah.
And that's happened in Hawkwind. I'm putting that mildly, and that's happened in the Waterboys in perhaps a nicer way. But there's people who feel like they're a little bit discarded, as it were. So I think that's and that's a natural thing when you get yourself into that sort of situation, I guess. But there's a great analogy in that, in terms of one person hearing the sound he wants to, and Mike talks about that, doesn't he? Mike says that his involvement with Hawkwind over the years has often been to create a starting point.
Yeah.
For Dave Brock, and then Dave Brock would go off on a completely different tangent, but it was the starting point that he'd sprung from.
Yeah. So how does Mike Murcock get involved with Hawkwind? Where does it come from?
I think it's he goes to a gig. He can't. I looked this up in my book, and I don't think he can remember exactly where it was. But he goes to a London gig in the company of John Trucks from Friends magazine, and possibly also M. John Harrison, and meets Dave Brock and Nick Turner, who of course are already huge Mike Moorcock fans.
Right.
And ask him to be involved. So he's got Sonic Attack and Use Your Armor and stuff like that to read, and will turn up and read his poetry under the Westway for the free gigs in Ladbroke Grove and stuff like that. And Mike is in Ladbroke Grove, and all this counterculture is happening around him. And he has a similar experience to Dave Brock in terms of how he gets into music in the first place, playing banjo in coffee bars and stuff, So though they, their stories don't converge until he goes to this Hawkwind gig, they have the same sort of experiences of turning up and playing in coffee bars and things like that through the 60s.
Yeah.
And so he becomes part of that melting pool of people who are circulating around the band. So that would be Barney Bubbles, the great graphics designer, Phil Franks, who took a lot of the photography, and Robert Calvert, who filled some of the role that Mike also did of being the guy who comes on and declaims this poetry. Sometimes it's his own poetry, sometimes it's Mike's work that he'll read. He might read a Gunter Grass poem. He might find some other esoteric thing that he wants to declaim from the stage, and Mike will stand back and let him do it, because Mike's got this great career as an editor and as a writer, and Bob Calvert is trying to find his way as a sort of poet and would-be singer musician type thing. So Mike stands back and lets him do it, but is always on the periphery there of joining in. And Bob Calvert has various different psychological problems that means he's not available all the time. So if there's a gig that he's supposed to be at and he can't make it, maybe Mike will go and do it instead. Yeah. So Mike's very generous and stands back and lets Bob get on with a lot of it, but he's always there as a presence, at the Windsor Free Festival or at Hammersmith Odeon through the years, and then in sessions for Warrior on the Edge of Time, which was supposedly the eternal champion, but is a very, very loose and again a good example of there's Mike Moorcock's starting point, and Dave Brock's gone off on a different tangent, but Mike has come in and read a couple of the poems and has contributed the lyrics to Kings of Speed, which I think existed beforehand, and then Dave gave it a new tune, and inspires Nick Turner's writing of Dying Seas, and at the same time is doing New World's Fair, which actually I was listening today and is a much more cohesive record in my mind. I never get the great outpouring of what a classic Warrior is. And I always think it's not as good as the things around it. It's not as good as Hall of the Mountain Grill. And it's not as fresh as Astounding Sound's amazing music. But I was listening to New World's Fair, which I don't listen to a lot, but I put it on today and I thought, you know what, this isn't Hawkwind. This is more Mott the Hoople, David Bowie, but as a dystopian thing, it hangs together much better than Warrior does.
Yeah, and I suppose for people listening, we should point out that New World's Fair was essentially Murcock's album, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
It was released under the name The Deep Fix, Michael Murcock and the Deep Fix, wasn't it?
Yeah, and a couple of guys that are credited with him as the Deep Fix, and then various different Hawkwind musicians playing on it. I think Dave Brock plays guitar on it, and Simon House turns up with his violin or his mellotron or what have you. I think Alan Powell plays on it. I think Nick Turner was supposed to play on it and maybe did play on it, but got mixed out in the final mix, I think is the legend on that one. But yeah, I think it was, I was surprised again listening to it today, just how cohesive it is, and you think, is there a storyline? And I'm not sure there really is, but it's really great dystopian. Nick Turner in the sleeve notes for the Esoteric edition says that he thinks it's inspired by is it Dreamland at Margate, the old funfair there? And he can see Mike wandering through and seeing all this dystopian and, on the edge of time stuff happening, And it does feel like that. And it is, I think it does. It feels like a Bowie album or a Mott the Hoople album. And, in that sense, it feels like it's of its time. But it's a little bit unfairly overlooked, I think. Whereas Warrior is this great classic that I just don't get. I like it individually, but I don't like it as an album.
Yeah, I came across Hawkwind and the Deep Fix New World's Fair album probably around about the same time, because I very much got into Murcock first and didn't really discover the connection with Hawkwind until years later, because there was no internet in those days, of course. But one day I was in Sydney Scarborough's record shop in Hull in the basement where all the rock music was, and I saw the cover of the Chronicle of the Black Sword. I was like, what? And this is one of these brilliant things about being a Murcock fan pre-internet days, where you suddenly make these connections and things fall into place. So you think, what is going on here? But a while later I got a copy of, I didn't buy it, probably because I didn't have enough pocket money on me or whatever it was. And a while later I got New World's Fair, and I got a Hawkwind compilation. You remember the days of those terrible early days of CD, and you'd get compilations which they weren't best ofs. They were pretty random, and they would try and convince you that it was actually a studio album. And sometimes,
yes,
and there were re-recordings by some of the band members.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
got this Hawkwind compilation, and it had Quark, Strangers and Charm on it, and a couple of other bits and bobs, and I had New World's Fair, and I preferred New World's Fair.
Mm.
Because it was more consistent, and of course, if you get a crappy Hawkwind compilation, which is all over the place,
Yeah,
you're not
all
going to get
different
any.
eras and,
Yeah,
and various different outtake stuff
yeah. I
that's
think it
got
had a
around over
live
the.
version
There's
of
a lot of it.
it had a live version of Silver Machine on it. I think at the same time, on the same day, I got a Moody Blues one as well, just because it had. I can't remember the track. There's a track off Days of. Oh, I can't remember the name of the album. Anyway, I picked that up, and I picked up the other two, and I got an Alan Price live album, which was an unofficial bootleg, but it was almost exactly the same track list as the famous studio produced and published Alan Price live album from the late 70s with the big band backing, but it was a different recording, and it was like a really cheap label with no proper booklet. So I would get these. You'd get these things in these crappy
Yeah.
these cheap shops in Hull where you'd get a CD for £2, which even in those days was pretty cheap. So yeah, I really liked New World's Fair, and I must say it is quite a while since I've listened to it. I really should go back and listen to it. But I think, I mean, I know this is probably heretical, but I think I'd rather listen to that than Chronicle of the Black Sword.
Well, I think the thing about Chronicle of the Black Sword is that people like the studio album or they like the live album.
Mm.
And if you like the live album, you're going to find the studio album a little bit underdone
Yeah.
and a little bit overproduced.
Yeah.
If that isn't a contradiction in terms, but of course, what it misses that the live double has is Hugh Lloyd Langton's great songs, Moonglum and Dreaming City, for a start, and it does miss. The studio album misses the dynamics of the live album. So it is, it's a bit of a cliche in Hawkwind fandom terms, but that live album is really the capture of the Black Sword concept, much more than the studio album, I think.
Yeah, one of the questions I was going to ask you at some point was actually, what is the definitive Murcock and Hawkwind collaboration? Is it that live album?
I think it probably. I'm going to be heretical and say it probably is. Lots of people who are Hawkwind fans will be listening to this and going, "It's Warrior on the Edge of Time. What are you on about?" But I think I think that that live that tour. Of course, Mike appeared a few times on that tour. Not every night, but he appeared at Hammersmith a couple of nights, and I think he might have appeared at Preston. I might be making that up, but I think he appeared 2 or 3 times on the tour, and then it's captured on the video of the tour as well, with Mike doing the opening narration in his dinner jacket and dicky bow tie, and famously says that, or at least he says to me on the email interview I did with him for the book, that he'd taken a load of Elric paperbacks to distribute to the audience and liberally distributed them at the end of the gig, only to see them ripped to pieces by people trying to get their hands on them. So I think that live album is a real pinnacle of their work together, particularly because you get Mike coming on and doing his bits. I mean, he's not on the original release of the album for contractual reasons, but I think he has been reinstated on some of the editions that came later.
Right.
But you certainly see him on the video, and I think it's just I think that's a great because although there's a few Hawkwind standards peppered in the set, you get Masters of the Universe and you get Assault and Battery, but it's largely a new set, so they're going out and playing a set of songs that nobody's heard before, all wrapped up and inspired by the Elric novels, and clearly, different members of the band had done a lot of work on that, had read around it and come up with a storyline and lyrics that were relevant. So I think it captured what they were trying to do much better than Warrior did as a supposed Eternal Champion concept album.
Yeah. I mean, kind of, I suppose, going back to when he first had that contact with them and first started to collaborate with them, what kind of impact do you think he had on their music? Because we've mentioned that Hawkwind, to all intents and purposes, probably got some pretty rough treatment at the hands of the press. And I think there's a certain kind of sense amongst the serious that a band that hook up with a fantasy author and do poetry on stage and grand concept albums, when prog rock, of course, was becoming quite something of a bloated joke with triple albums and Emerson, Lake and Palmer with their 3 lorries each and, and all that business. But what kind of impact do you think Murcock had on Hawkwind? Because
well, when you put it like that, on paper it doesn't sound very good, does it? But
it reminds me a little bit of like, Spinal Tap's plans for Kinky Jack.
Yes, yeah, and the Chronicles of the Black Sword could have easily have tipped over into being Spinal Tap in the way it was presented on stage, that's for sure. But I think that Moorcock validated their counterculture crossover. I think he gave them some direction, not all of the direction, because some of it came from Barney Bubbles, some of it very much came from Bob Calvert. But he gave them a direction where their stuff was, things like Psychedelic Warlords, Sick of Politicians, Harassment and Laws, all that sort of stuff, feels very New World. So I think that New World's ethos permeated what Hawkwind were doing, and I think that's why when punk came along, they were the ones that weren't dismissed.
Yeah.
And so maybe it was a little bit of a guilty pleasure for a while from somebody from the Stranglers or the Buzzcocks or Susan the Banshees or whoever, but Jello Biafra particularly and Dead Kennedys, but all of them now would say, I took something from Hawkwind. It might be Dave Brock's guitar playing, it might be Bob Calvert's work, but it certainly also was their involvement with Mike Moorcock and the counterculture kudos and credibility that Mike has, not only from his own writings, but because of New Worlds.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to forget now, isn't it, when you're talking about a guy who was just about to turn 81, who's published over 100 fantasy novels. It's difficult to appreciate for people who weren't around at the time just how counterculture he was and just how close to that stuff he was. But also, I think what we find whenever we look at Moorcock as well is, no matter what he's doing at any given time, he always has this community around him that he nurtures. And he did it with other writers. He made Jerry Cornelius a shared character for a period of time and gave people his blessings to write Cornelius short stories. And at the same time, he's kind of got this community that he's moving in and out of related to music. And I was thinking about what you were saying earlier on about Jello Biafra, but there's a Ministry concert from the 90s where Ministry are playing their hard brand of Al Jurgensen's industrial rock stroke metal behind a huge wire fence, and the audience are absolutely rabid, throwing bottles at the fence, and bottles are smashing and scattering beer and glass all over the band, and in the middle there's Jello Biafra reading poetry. And it's like Hawkwind and Michael Murkock times Mad Max, and I think that's that Ministry concert.
And absolutely, he'd have got that from Mike Moorcock and Bob Calvert.
Yeah.
It could, because Jello Biafra was not only a fan, but he was a fan who'd go to gigs when they played in America and stuff. So I wouldn't have seen Mike Moorcock with Hawkwind in America, because I don't think Mike ever appeared at any American Hawkwind gigs. But certainly would have seen Bob Calvert, and Bob was very influenced by Mike.
Yeah.
So I think there is an absolute direct line to what you're saying there to Hawkwind, and that's why they continue to have been relevant to that era that I grew up in, because that bloated prog rock thing that you described, the ELPs and the Genesis and the Yeses, were not my music. My music was the Pistols and the Clash. Yeah. Clash would, of course, taken away from Hawkwind and Mike that whole Lab Book Grove ethos.
Yeah,
that's what Joe Strummer and Mick Jones would have taken from that.
Yeah, Hawkwind they've got that wonderful. I don't know if rough edge is the right way of describing it, but they've got a slightly chaotic fringe around their music. So Psychic Warlords is probably my favourite Hawkwind track. I absolutely love it. But I must confess, Hawkwind are one of those bands where can I listen to a full album by them in one sitting? Maybe, maybe not. But there are specific tracks by them that I absolutely love. I absolutely love Psychic Warlords. I'm probably with you on Warrior on the Edge of Time. I think it's a little bit patchy.
Yeah,
but it's got great stuff on it. It's got great tracks on it.
Oh yeah, individually there's some wonderful stuff on it, but the production's quite poor, and the concept doesn't hang together. So if you're going to do a concept album, do a concept album. It sort of isn't. It doesn't do what it says on the tin. So
that's one of the weird things about Hawkwind, isn't there? There's that whole pretentious thing about prog rock bands doing, I don't know, Kinky Jack with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra or whatever. But Hawkwind never committed fully and never went there until Chronicle of the Black Sword.
Yeah, true,
Yeah.
true. And the Black Sword it's almost Spinal Tap. It really is. I remember seeing it on the.
By the time they did it, it was the 80s.
I saw the last night of the tour. Me and my mate were at Bristol Hippodrome for the last night of the tour. I think we had like the last couple of tickets that were available, and we loved it. But it should so easily have tipped over into being that caricature of itself. They just about got away with it. They just about got away with it. And of course you don't get that sense on the album, with the studio album or the live album unit. When you see it live and see the photographs and the costumes and all that sort of stuff, you think, whoa, they were on the edge there. They nearly tipped over into parody, but
it's not quite King Arthur on Ice.
But you asked me about what what are the great moments of Mike and Hawkwind together, and the other one is Sonic Attack, because that album, the version of Sonic Attack on it is far from my favourite, but that album with Mike's vocals on Coded Languages and his lyrics on Lost Chances, and that whole, I call it Concrete Cold War Hawkwind, I found really appealing, and I think Mike had added quite a lot to that as well.
Yeah. What about his collaborations with other bands?
The collaboration with Blue, I can't say it. You can fix that in a minute, can't you? The collaboration with Blue Oyster Cult completely passed me by. I've never heard it. I can't, so I can't talk about it. One thing I must listen to soon is his work with Don Falcone and Spirits Burning. And they've got an album out in the last couple of months that I need to get on my Christmas list, because that looks really fantastic. And Don had done some work previously with some demos that existed of Mike's work that I thought was interesting. But Hollowlands, isn't it? That's the new album by Spirits Burning. That's the Mike Moorcock crossover, if I remember right. I think that's what it's called.
Was Hollowlands the first one, or Hollowlands, because they did one they released one last year or the back end of the year before, so it's the second one they've done.
Yeah, so I've got to. I've been really busy this year. Funnily enough, lockdown has not eased my workload, so I've been really busy in a 9 to 5. But and so a lot of stuff has passed me by. But that's on my list to have a listen to.
Yeah. I've got to admit, probably if I had to pick one favourite Michael Murcock rock band collaboration, it would probably be Veteran of the Psychic Wars. I
Blue Oyster Cult.
Yeah. Whereas the flip side of that is he did Black Blade with Blue Oyster Cult, and I think it completely flips over into Cheeseball.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I'll have to get on Spotify or wherever and try and get a listen to those, because those have passed me by over the years, and actually, in truth, I should have researched those for my Hawkwind book and compared and contrasted, but I never did. So,
to my knowledge, he only did the two with Blue Oyster Cult, but Black Blade is kind of too far towards what we described earlier as maybe just going a little bit too kinky jack. But Veteran of the Psychic Wars is just a really cracking track all the way around. Really, really good. In fact, I used it as the opening bars as the opening music for the podcast until I realised I might get pinged for a copyright.
Yes, there is a danger there. There is a danger.
Replace it with my friend's band.
I'll have to go and check it out.
Yeah, do so and let me know what you think.
Yeah, we'll do.
It's that period of Blue Oyster Cult where everything is again very clean. It's very heavily produced, so it's not rough and kind of a little bit dangerous and reckless sounding like the best Hawkwind stuff is from the 70s.
Yes, yeah.
I say the best Hawkwind from the 70s. I really love Carry On Sundown as well, if I've got the name of that right. Hurry On Sundown.
Hurry On Sundown. Yeah. It's a lovely sing along track. I was talking to one of the interviews I did a few years ago was with and I'm going to forget his name now. The guy from Cooler Shaker.
Crispian Mills.
Yeah, Crispian Mills. Yeah, and he was saying, I used to play that as a busking tune. I used to put the hat around and play Hurry On Sundown, and it was a really good one to busk along to.
I think they might have done that as a B-side.
I think they did. Yeah,
I'm
I think
sure
they did
I've
in the
heard
early days
of that.
Yeah.
And much like their version of Hush, it's a very clean, faithful well produced, heavily produced, however you want to put it, cover version.
Yeah, yeah.
I was actually quite fond of Cooler Shaker up until he did his what was it, his Nazi fancy dress or whatever it is that got him in bother.
Yeah, I'm not sure what that was. I was interviewing for an album called K2, which I really liked and had some stuff that he reckoned was very free festival influence. So it was a nice chat. Yeah.
And I never really kind of got Cooler Shaker, and they were in charts and they'd had a few singles, but I got drunk in a heavy metal club, and they played Hey Dude on these massive monitors, and I was absolutely shit faced. And I danced to Hey Dude like a lunatic. I think this is how long ago. I think I was drunk on Copperhead cider.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I don't think Copperhead cider's even existed for 20 years.
It's gone to
but as a result, I was
and Breaker Lager. Yeah.
As a result, I was quite fond of Cooler Shaker for that reason. Yeah. So what's next for you then? What are you working on at the moment?
I am. Well, the day job is very all-consuming because I work for the Hall for Cornwall Theatre in Truro. I found my way to the charity and cultural sector, and I work for the Hall for Cornwall Theatre. That's in the middle of a big capital rebuild project with intention to reopen autumn 21. So that's been working on that has been really consuming my headspace. But I do have an idea for a book that might be called No Star Unturned, like my blog, but it might be called No Star Unturned and might be subtitled Space Rock's Strangest Trips. So I'm having a look at that at the moment. It's a notion I'm playing with. It's probably 21 albums because that's a nice number. 21 albums by 21 different bands of the space rock genre, and how those things join up, because space rock is such a such a strange beast. I've said before that it can be the big industrial space freighter chugging down the spaceways, or it can be Dave Brock's hand on the solar winds in a solar yacht, and a light touch thing. So I'm really interested in the way that that space rock thing is developed. Nick Turner playing his flute in the Great Pyramid is suddenly, creating the Sphinx album, then influenced bands in America to do their own version of that, and then to get Nick over to play, and Jane Weaver more recently, who's sampled stuff from Church of Hawkwind, and brought that into her music. So, and other bands that I really like, Osrix. What's the Osrix thing in the festival scene, and what did they take from Hawkwind? And then bands like Wooden Ships and Moon Duo in America these days. How they developed space rock. So I think, trying to find the right angle for it to keep it fun, but also serious in a way might be the way to go. So that's the thing that's on my mind at the moment. It's space rock's strangest trips. I just got to find the time to do it. But that's the one that's on my mind at the moment.
In order to stimulate your thinking, then, I'm going to put you on the spot. And for people who love Murcock and for people who love Hawkwind and space rock and maybe prog rock, what would be your 5 suggestions for them to explore outside of Hawkwind?
Oh, I would definitely recommend it's not a double album, it's 2 albums, but they run concurrent, called Occult Architecture by Moon Duo from a couple of years ago. One album is heavy weather winter stuff, one album's light and summery, and if you play the 2 together, you feel the seasons changing. And those are a couple of records I play an awful lot. Really enjoying the new Mugstar album that came out last month, I think. And I can't for the life of me remember what it's called, but I bought that on vinyl. It's the first thing I bought on vinyl for a while, and I've been playing that. So those are 2 of my recommendations. Jane Weaver's got a new album out next year. It's not space rock, but she is influenced by Hawkwind. And I had a promotional copy of that recently, and I've started to get into that. So Jane Weaver definitely something that's of interest to people who like the sort of more electronica side of Hawkwind that's typified by the Church of Hawkwind album from back in the early 80s. That would be a hot tip from me. And also Carrie Grace. Listened to a lot of her stuff recently. Again, she's not specifically space rock, but she's in that whole Cosfest and Fruits de Mer record label type environment of that really great little scene that's grown up around space rock and little semi-free festival, not free festivals you pay to go in, but they have the free festivals vibe. Bands like Sendelica also very influential on that. But those would be my hot tips. So Mugstar, Moon Duo, Jane Weaver, Carrie Grace, and some Sendelica.
That's great. I'm going to look all those up once we're finished. So, you know what, Ian? It's been absolutely great talking to you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
You know what, that card on that launderette corkboard has produced some nice results for me. And we will be back down in Cornwall at some point when all of this plague has ended. Because we tend to go down there once a year, so hopefully we can do this again sometime, maybe even in person in a booth.
Yeah, we can have a beer and set the world to rights. That would be really great.
Yeah. Also, drop me a line after you've listened to the Spirits Burning albums, because I'll do the same and maybe we can compare notes.
Yeah, excellent. We will do.
All right, that's brilliant. Cheers, Ian. Thanks
Super.
for joining.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
Cheers.
Take a swig of Doom Bar.
I've just poured this beer, and it's very, very viscous.
Hold that thought, because I'm going to put the Doom Bar aside. And I'm going to open my comedy beer as well.
Yours is in a tin.
No,
it's in a bottle.
Oh, motherfucker.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, that may have been a crass error. Anyway, that aside,
Brilliant.
just as Ian Abrahams was going down in the lift from Derry Toms, who pops out but Loz with some stupid beer?
As usual. Yeah.
So I've sat back down again, and Loz is here, and we're gonna talk. Well, we're probably gonna mention beer in a second, but we're also gonna talk a little bit about music and Giantkind, seeing as this is a music episode. So, Loz, what comedy beer have you just opened before I just accidentally drank something disgusting?
Well, this one is a Flying Dog Gonzo Imperial Porter. Rocking in at a 10%er.
Ooh.
And it's got a quote from Hunter S. Thompson on the side.
Bloody hippies.
It never got weird enough for me. And that's probably the worst intonation I've ever heard of any quote. Right. But anyway, so I've just taken a swig out of it, but I'll go for another one soon as we're having a chat.
Yeah.
I would say it was a cross between gravy, bit of chocolate.
That's not a bad start.
Yeah, gravy, chocolate, and creosote, maybe. Yeah, I wouldn't drink it for pleasure.
No, okay.
It's got that usual imperial porter sweetness. It's the equivalent of barley wine, isn't it?
It's funny you should say that, because I've got a triple Carmelier, which is some kind of Belgian joke beer to trap Englishmen into being foolish. And it's 8.4%. It's by Bosteel's Brewery. As you may have heard, I already had a quick swig because it bubbled over the top when I took the top off and is now all over my desk and I ain't got a cloth. So I've just foolishly wiped it up with my hand and on my pants. So my pants stink of bad beer now. But here we go. And I don't want to offend anybody Belgian or any Belgian beer enthusiast hipsters, but I'm going to go in now. Okay, it tastes like Kapaki 9. Yeah.
Which is?
It might be in a fancy bottle, but it tastes like Kapaki 9, which is... It's like the modern equivalent of Tennant's Super Strength, in that it's favoured of people who have a limited amount of cash and need to get as shit-faced as possible as fast as possible. Kind of like us back in the day when we only had so much money. So we used to get a 2-litre bottle of Carbon White and 4 cans of Orange Boom and mix it up and drink it as fast as possible in order to get the maximum bang for our buck. Although that might be me and Stevie Mac, not me and you. I can't remember.
Yeah, we used to drink Sheridans, if I remember rightly.
Oh yeah, yeah.
As you do.
Yeah, but to be fair, we drank the Sheridans because we thought it made it look sophisticated. And
After
what we
the
were really
18
doing was,
Orangi boom.
Yeah, what we were really doing was hastening my plunge onwards into diabetes.
yeah, but looking back, great days.
Well, I wouldn't have it any other way.
No.
Right, so while I grimace my way through this of course is a music show, and of course you and Neil, friend of the show Neil, and patron
Indeed.
of course, and Neil, who helped me out a lot with the sound early on, had your own band back in the day.
We did, yeah.
Giantkind.
We had 3 iterations of the band, I would say. We had the whole version.
Yep.
We had London version 1 and then London version 2.
Yeah.
Started in the 90s, in the heady days of tinny indie rock, and carried on till probably 2004, 5. When I had a child and realised the combination of having to have a job and a child and living in London wasn't really compatible with playing toilets to 4 people and a dog. Much as, the glamour was there, obviously, when we, got ourselves ready, travelled across London, and there was more in the band than there was in the audience. It was time to maybe take stock.
Yeah, I do remember those heady days of having just about every mate I had was in a band of some description, and of course there were all those classic Adelphi whole bands like oh god, who was there? There was Lithium Joe.
Lithium Space Maid.
Space Maid, yeah. Chris Black, of course, old mate of mine in Space Maid.
Was he? Right, okay.
Yeah. Just got back in touch with him on Twitter, funnily enough, very recently. Yeah, good mates with Chris back in the day. They all used to live in a house down Park Grove that I spent many, many entertaining evenings in, getting up to no good for a variety of reasons. And actually, it was Chris Black, I don't know if you remember, but I actually recorded some Depeche Mode cover versions way back in the day that I used to have on a C90 cassette. So I did some singing for a Depeche Mode cover or 2. And it was Chris Black who did all the sequencing, and he was the keyboard whiz who was in Space Maid. So Chris Black, the drummer in Space Maid, was terrific with keyboards. And oh god, there was loads, wasn't there? There was loads.
Yeah, it was. The thing is with Adelphi, the quality control was quite low, wasn't it? So if you had some amps and some drums, not necessarily drums, but if you had some equipment and you could play for more than 10 minutes, you got a gig, really, didn't you?
Yeah, and of course, because I used to knock about with all them lot when I was a teenager, and I was always in pubs watching my mates' bands. By the time we became friends, like you, me and Neil, and Robbo, hello Robbo, if you're listening, I kind of got to that point where if my mates were in bands, I didn't go to see them in the pub. And I think I knew you lot for about 3 years before I ever ventured out to see you. And I remember, I hope this isn't a painful memory for you, and you probably won't remember it at all, but I do remember being the only person in the audience when you played a gig at the Lamp.
Oh no, I think that's probably the greatest gig we had. So, somebody said, do you want to play New Year's Day? Right, so you think... At the time, gigs were quite hard to come by. It's like, well, they weren't, but it was like, you headline New Year's Day, and we didn't really think about it. And went, oh yeah, that'd be brilliant. Then realised it's New Year's Day. It's like, who's going to come out on New Year's Day? So we played this gig, and in the end, we thought, we'll just play loads of comedy covers. Yeah. I don't mean comedy, but covers anyway. And I think there was 4 people in. One of them was my sister, and halfway through the set, the dog that lived at the venue just basically came on stage and fell asleep. It was like, that's when you know you've hit it.
Yeah, but you know what? You showed some real commitment, and you powered on through all that, and even carried on when you all moved to London.
Yeah, so we all moved to London specifically to be in the band. So we did a few gigs. And we had a few record companies ring up, and it was always, can you get down to London? So we did a couple of shows, and in the end it was, we'll just move to London. What's the worst that can happen? Yeah, so it was good. We moved to London. We played a lot. We're doing all right. And then we had the usual tragedies of family issues and all that kind of stuff. And we kind of split up for about 6-7 months. And then it all fell apart, and then we rebuilt the band.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was just the usual thing of being in an unsigned band is always the same, isn't it? You just scrabble around for small victories in life, don't you? And they're generally mostly awful.
I've been to see, at the very least, 2 of my friends' band in the Dublin Castle. In London, and again been one of only 3 or 4 people, and I can't remember whether it was Giantkind or Rich Baker and Lee's band. Were they called Motorcade by that point? I can't remember, but whenever they played in London, they had one guy who was like a super fan, who whenever they started playing, even if he was the only person there, he would get up and just walk up and stand a foot from the stage and stare at the band, nodding his head with a look of ecstasy on his face. And I can't remember whether that was you.
No, that wasn't us. No. Because we're in London, we kind of ended up. You meet new people, don't you? And you end up with a new audience almost. Because as you said, most of the time you're inside band, your mates come and see you, don't they? Or your girlfriends or your girlfriend's mates, and it's like, oh yeah, we're mates in a band, and then eventually they realise it's really quite tedious and boring. Yeah. And being in London, nobody knew us, so it's pretty good. Yeah, it
does sound a little bit like the UK wrestling event where the Grimsby wrestlers turned up and were half of the audience, but you didn't realise until they invaded the ring. It's like the music equivalent of that. You know,
yeah, pretty much.
The girlfriends and the mates from other bands. It's just, unfortunately, the mates from other bands don't rush the stage and suplex you through the drum kit, which might have made it more exciting.
Well, they did occasionally, but that was just like if you borrowed the ramp or something. So we got like one record out in the shop, so we got some radio play. The best thing we did, we got a plugger who basically got us loads of radio play, which was cool.
So what were your inspirations back in the day?
It was the usual nonsense. I think you kind of go through periods. Like when we first started playing, because I didn't start singing until I was about 19, so I was always too shy. So it was. But we first started playing like Patti Smith and Violent Femmes and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then I was into REM, and then as you get older, you kind of get into loads of different stuff, don't you? So by the time I was in London, and the song that you play at the beginning of the show, which is called Baptism, that was recorded in London, and we kind of getting into using a few sequencers, and we got a new guitarist with us as well. So there was 5 of us, and we had a studio for about a year. Our favourite bands were stuff like Pavement and Deus and lots of indie stuff. Got quite into the Beach Boys, this usual indie boy stuff, really. But it was also into like a bit of techno and underworld and and then Neil and Carl got super into more the dance scene stuff, really.
Yeah.
But luckily we never did a Soup Dragons and started putting on comedy drum beats and going, oh yeah, we've always been a dance band.
Yeah.
Like loads of indie
critical error.
Yeah. And then after that we kind of, because Carl, the drummer's dad, died and he moved back up north for about a year.
Yeah.
So we didn't do anything for a year really. And then Neil moved up north as well. So I started up writing some stuff with another guy called Dave. And then Carl came back and we ended up just setting up a kind of a second band, really.
Yeah.
We ended up with a Canadian drummer. When we started playing, then it was a bit more acoustic-y, not totally tedious acoustic stuff, but it was more. I got quite into Low, and so we kind of Low and Tool were kind of our touch points at one point, with a bit of Bright Eyes thrown in. It was
Bright Eyes. Cool. I love Watership Down.
Yeah, that one.
So what's the story behind the Breakfast in the Ruins track?
Well, the title's cool, isn't it? So if you write in lyrics, I wrote all the lyrics. As soon as you read something like Breakfast in the Ruins, before I even read the book, I was like, it kind of conjures up quite a cool image, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
And then basically the entire song is based on my interpretation of the end of the world, but based on Carrying Up the Khyber at the end. So the whole thing was that Carrying Up the Khyber, the bit where they're just all having the meal, the upper class officers and everything, and they're all getting bombed and they carry on eating. I just thought that was like perfect metaphor for England.
We laugh about how lame a lot of the Carry On movies were, and and how they are it's kind of part of British culture. Sex of Jim Dale and Barbara Windsor having her shirt pulled off and all that nonsense. But Carrying Up the Khyber is special. There's two scenes in the Carry On series that really sum up Britain perfectly, and one is the banquet at the end of Carrying Up the Khyber, and the other one is Carrying at Your Convenience, where they all go on strike because somebody asks a bidet fitter to fit a tap. And then, after they've all gone on strike, they all go to the seaside, and it becomes a sex comedy chase around the seaside. And it's just perfect encapsulations of how ridiculous Britain was at the time. Amazing.
Yeah, and I think so. The Carry On the Khyber thing was like, okay, so we've as our age, we just we're brought up with nuclear war, weren't we? As the biggie.
Yeah.
And then it was like, let's drop in AIDS as another winner.
Yeah.
And then we had Thatcher and unemployment. And it's got, you kind of brought up with all these triple whammies, aren't you? And it's kind of, right, okay. And you've still got that British stiff upper lip bullshit, haven't you?
Yeah.
We're British, we've got the empire. And I just remember just thinking, if the world was going to end, we'd still be, pretty much having our full English is just as the nuclear bomb goes off, won't we?
Yeah.
Drinking our bitter, blah, blah, and complaining about the coldness of the beans or something. So that's the whole song.
If the bomb was about to drop and the balloon's about to go up, I think probably eating a fry up and drinking a beer, maybe a couple of other things if you could fit them into those 5 minutes.
Yeah.
That we can't mention because they're too rude.
No, pizzas,
yeah. I think would be absolutely spot on, provided it wasn't triple Carmelier.
I mean, I'm halfway through the Gonzo now, and it's kind of sitting quite heavy, to be honest.
Back to Breakfast in the Ruins, the song. So, what was your process? Did you write the lyrics and then approach one of the band and say, let's put some music to this, or how did it work?
What we always used to do, so I either wrote with Carl or Dave or Neil or whatever, and it was lyrics first, and we fit the music around the lyrics. But Breakfast in the Ruins, Carl basically recorded everything on it, including guitar, drums. First time he'd ever done it. And he had some vocals on it, and I heard it, and I said, I can put something over that. So I basically got the bus to Cleethorpes, went to a seaside studio and just recorded it. I just sang it on the way on a Walkman and thought, that'll fit. Yeah. And we just recorded it. Yeah. It's probably the first time me and Carl had written anything together. So So lyrics were written, because I always had a book of lyrics and just tried to fit it to that song, and it worked really well.
Yeah.
And then when we re-recorded it, we kind of changed a few of the lyrics, but we played it quite a bit on stage. It was good.
So the one I'm going to put at the end of this show, which version is that?
That's the 1992 version.
Blimey.
I know. It's ridiculous, isn't it? The weird thing is kind of, in the olden days, you used to like spend a tenner an hour in a crap studio and watch your money just like piss down the, just watch it, just go as like you're listening to the drums for 5 hours, going, that's cost 50 quid.
Yeah.
And then because you're the singer, at the end, you get like 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So it's generally, oh, man, yeah. Yeah, so this version is, the really old version.
Well,
and I don't sound like that anymore. I appreciate
you letting me use it to play out the show.
Yeah, that's cool. It's good. It's quite interesting hearing Baptism again, so it does sound quite good. That was used on Channel 4 documentary as well.
Right.
So, yeah.
What was it? What was the documentary?
It was a documentary about the Craze.
No way.
So one of my mates in London, he worked for Channel 4 as an editor, and he had to do the music for it, and he picked loads of really shit music. He had like Screwdriver on and stuff like that. So he asked me to get some music together, and part of it he played Baptism over some of the credits, and it did a bit of curation to go with some of the stuff, which was good. And then we had we had one of the other songs on a film, an indie film, which was really, yeah. I'll say no more, but it was on there.
Oh, I've got to seek it out now. So of course, whenever I open up one of the shows with, I don't know, some spooky reading or something like that, that's the longer intro to baptism, isn't it? With all the spooky noises.
It is, yeah. So when we played that live, we usually started a gig with it, and that sequencer goes on for. We used to play it for about 5 or 10 minutes, and then come on.
Well, of course, the closing music for the show has been Giantkind all the way as well, which I think is a cover version.
Oh yeah, that's a low song.
Right.
So yeah, we recorded that in Neil's bedroom. We did a weird kind of our interpretation of it. The Low are one of my favourite bands. There are 3 Mormons from where are they from? I want to say Utah, but I don't think they are. They basically do slowcore stuff.
Are they as good as the Utah Saints?
I would say they were different. I don't think you can compare the two.
Okay. Oh, cool, man. Well, thanks for letting us use it to play out the show. I say us, I mean me, and I mean you. Thanks for letting us, including you, use it to play out the show.
And I'm still waiting for my royalties check as well.
Yeah.
It's been disappointing. On the subject of that, very quickly, the TV show, I got a 50 quid check from Channel 4.
No way.
Yeah, spent
did
it.
you
So
cash it or frame it?
Yeah, I was skint, mate. It was either that or live on lard butties for a week. So I think it was that 50 quid got spent. Great days.
Well, thanks again, and thanks for encouraging me to drink some truly awful Kapaki 9 clone beer. But we'll catch up again soon for the Night of the Swords Part 3.
We will.
Cheers, dude. Thanks to Ian for being such a great co-host on the show, our first foray into the sphere of Moorcock music. We'll hopefully catch up again and look at some stuff in some more detail. And in the meantime, I heartily recommend Ian's biography of Hawkwind, Sonic Assassins. It's available now in its revised and updated version, care of Lumoni Press. As discussed with Loz, the Giantkind number Breakfast in the Ruins will play us out at the close of the show. Meanwhile though, it's now time to thank our chaos engineers, out there platting the stuff of the grey fees and keeping the singularity at bay. Andrew Cicluna, Andrew Van Ness, Fred, Dave, Jim, John Lays, John Watt, Nelbert, Simon Perrins, Robbo, Malpertwee and Ben. And to our Jugaderos over at the Terminal Cafe, Clarkey, Craig, Loz, Matt, Randall, Steve, Tom, Ian, Mark and Alex. And of course to our patron demons, Master Peconti, supporter extraordinaire, Brute of Lashmars trying to sell him his home recorded cassette of sea shanties. We may have to do a review show on that further down the line. To Lord Norman, Baker on the Rocks, hypnotised by the music of the spheres, and as a result getting his balance of flour, sugar, and the souls of his vanquished adversaries completely wrong. And to the lapsed gamer, no longer quite so lapsed, but nevertheless looking to score some new dice that will manifest across all 7 ghost worlds at once. And to Dread Mortmain, still caged and stuffing her ears with hell broccoli to drown out the cries of anguish as Ian Beale realises his calendar is no longer the absolute Christmas shizzle. And to Sir Neil of Burton, the Destiny Knight, busy at his easel creating baffling images that balance exquisite perfection with depictions of the yellow snow of the 17 cities of the lower off Moo. And last, but not least, to Robert Paragraphus Pandemonium Macmillan. He's currently working on how he can set his book of Bob Dylan songs as haiku, to the music of a billion wailing supplicants, victims of the famous, or should I say infamous, 55 wiggles of the temple of the Sufus Prime. Right, that's about it from me for now. The Journal of Gerard Arthur Connolly is on a mid-season break. In other words, I've knocked out a few shows faster than I could get it written, but it will return soon with an all-new score. Before I go, don't forget you can follow and gab with us on Twitter and Instagram with the handle @BreakfastRuins. You can email us at breakfastruins@outlook.com. The blog is at breakfastintheruins.com. We have our Patreon page too. We're out there on most podcatchers. If you have a favourite and we're not on it, drop me a line and I'll see what I can do about it. But in the meantime, stay safe, and I'll see you soon on the Moonbeam Roads.
I teeter near a brink behind this chair. A blank abyss, it's moving, it's crumbling. I think I can ignore this. The table slipping, God damn it, I nearly spilled my drink. The city has gone. Followed the milk down the brink. A chain of hands to stop the falling. A chain of hands to stop the falling. The food's long coming, but there's no one to complain to. People are few, but I'm one. But I'm one of the last. A chain of hands to stop the falling. A chain of hands to stop the falling. Am I led? Am I desperate to join the sea? Am I led? Am I desperate to join the sea? My excuses have been perfect, paid with my breath. Now the cold has me cracking, the bones have been set. I stare at the view and breakfast in the ruins. Nothing can bother me. I love the taste of apathy. A chain of hands to stop the falling. A chain of hands to stop the falling. A chain of hands to stop the